It's great to be here. And what I want to talk a little bit about is the session, how it will go today. I've worked in pathways development in adolescent athletes all the way through to Olympians and professional sporting teams. And what I'm hoping to impart with you today is the areas that we focus on, whether you are at that end of the pathway or at the pointy end. These are like the big rocks. These are the big rocks that we as sports dietitians are working on with our elite athletes, but athletes are people first. So these are the things that have to fundamentally be the big ticket items to get the most out of our both health and performance. And I will say you can't have one without the other. So I'm hoping to impart with you today that you leave here with an understanding of what are those big five, and with some resource about how to go if you feel like you need to do a deep dive into any of these areas a little bit further, where you can go to seek that support. So I want to lay the foundation right for health and performance nutrition for today. And one of the ways I'll do that is I want to talk about availability. At the core of what we do as sports dietitians, we are trying to promote having adequate energy available to do the training and to do the work. In the case of adolescent athletes, also to incorporate the energy required for growth. We need macro availability. So macronutrients is the fancy name for carbohydrates, proteins, and fats, and they are required in different amounts depending on stage of growth, but also types of activity that individuals will do. I want to pick out some really key micronutrients that are so important for health and performance, and they are something that we focus on for athletes their entire lifespan. They are critical micronutrients. Being in our hot, humid Queensland weather, I'm going to focus a little bit on hydration and what's the sorts of things we should be thinking about there. I'm going to touch only very briefly on supplementation. While I've included here in the big rocks, always lots of interest around the area of supplementation. But to be honest, the first four are the big rocks. The supplementation is something we can add on top once all of those things are taken care of. So I'm going to dive straight into our first and most important area, and that's energy availability or energy. So just to set the scene, our energy requirement, we talk about energy in terms of feeling energetic, but what I'm talking about is actually the requirement for how many calories our body actually needs on a daily basis. Now, you might be surprised to know that the bulk of the calories that the body requires are for all of our physiological processes. So to keep our heart pumping, our lungs respirating, all of those sorts of things are called our basal metabolic rate. Now, as a percentage of our total requirements, it is the biggest part. So the energy required, even at rest, to keep our body moving, constitutes the bulk of our energy requirements. As growing and developing athletes, they will require even more because they're building new tissue and those sorts of things. The smaller part of our requirements, believe it or not, actually does come from exercise. So NEAT there is our non-exercise activity. So the walking around, the activities of daily living, fidgeting, twitching forms quite a big part of our energy requirements. TEF is the thermic effect of food, and that's just the energy required to eat, digest, and store nutrients in our body. So that requires energy within itself. And our exercise associated energy is actually one of the smaller parts of our total energy requirements. And it's the area people focus on a lot, but in fact, it's actually one of the smaller parts. For highly trained athletes doing lots of, formal training, that will tend to be a little bit bigger. But overall, the point I want to make is that we as people first, before athletes, require, a fair bit of energy. When we have a look at adolescent energy needs, so for those who are growing and developing, you can see pre-adolescent, so athletes who are not active, have similar requirements to adults. That's UK data that I've presented there. Similar in Australia. So the energy requirements for athletes who aren't very active and for those of larger adults are actually quite similar. When we overlay exercise to growing athletes, those energy demands go up really, really quite significantly. So it's a really important time for our young active adolescents to understand how much they need to be eating. What the extra, energy for adolescent athletes goes into the requirement to alter their body composition. So developing lean mass, increasing blood volume, growing and lengthening bones and depositing strength and minerals into those bones. Brain development requires a large amount of extra energy. And also hormones and developing and maturing organ systems. So all of those extra overlay for adolescent athletes is why it's such a crucial time to really focus on optimizing their intake to meet not just the needs of exercise, but first and foremost, the needs of that body to do all that it needs to do. What do we see sometimes when there might be a mismatch between energy intake and the requirements of the body and also exercise? Is we see sometimes puberty is delayed in our athletes, particularly if they specialise and are training in high volumes from a young age. Sometimes we see athletes with low energy availability might be shorter than perhaps they're genetically have a predisposition for. We see poor bone health, especially if we're having difficulty laying down from both an energy perspective, but also a micronutrient perspective. Enough mineralisation of bone can lead to poor bone health. We see hormone disruption when there is low energy availability. So we might have delayed onset of menstrual function in a female called primary amenorrhea. Or sometimes we might see irregular or cessation of periods in female athletes. And again, that's to do with that low energy availability. We see athletes who are in a state of low energy availability, they have an increased risk of both illness and injury. So immune systems can be suppressed. And also for reasons we talked about with the bone health, that can be disrupted. So increasing their risk of injury. And sometimes we see, it's not always, most of the athletes I work with who are development athletes, their mismatch with energy intake and output and requirements is due to predominantly inadvertent underfueling. But sometimes there is, I guess, a purposeful restriction of intake, which might lead us more into that disordered eating area. And that's something to focus, to have a little bit of an eye on for adolescent athletes as well. The reason why, and sometimes I should point out in that vein that sometimes we have these physiological and whole of body system issues, even in an athlete who may not be, for example, presenting with visible or obvious weight loss. Our bodies are really clever. When we are being physically active, it does redirect the energy we consume into the activity. But what it does as a response to that is dim down some other what are probably considered non-life essential functions at that time. So that's where hormones get disrupted, growth is slowed, even digestive tract can slow down too when we're not eating enough energy. So where do we get our energy from? Well, we get our energy, probably most people are aware, from food, and in particular the macronutrients in food. So they are things that we've all heard of before: carbohydrates, proteins and fats. I'm going to talk about micronutrients in a moment. But as far as our macronutrients go, the one piece of this puzzle that is most critical for growing and developing adolescent athletes, and also all athletes, is their intake of carbohydrate. So carbohydrate is things like our breads, cereals, rice, pasta, noodles, fruit, starchy vegetables, legumes. They are the foods that yield carbohydrate. Now, carbohydrates are incredibly important, the most important nutrient, particularly for active athletes and also developing and adolescent athletes as well. So those carbohydrates will provide instant energy. So, servicing our muscles and brain from our blood glucose. We store carbohydrate in our liver as muscles as something called glycogen, and that's to use later. Carbohydrate foods are typically the ones that provide fiber, which is really important for our bowel health and digestive tract. Carbohydrate foods are also where we will get our prebiotic, our gut bacteria. A healthy gut bacteria is important for immune function, important for cognitive function and mental well-being. We're seeing lots of link between gut health and mood and well-being from that perspective. Immune function is supported by adequate carbohydrate. So if we're not eating enough carbohydrate, our immune system can be suppressed, so we can be more prone to illness. Our brains can only use glucose or carbohydrates as its preferred fuel source. So cognitive function, memory, if we're studying, trying to recall things for student athletes. So brain function is really heavily impacted by available blood glucose. And of course, muscle function. So our muscles' preferred fuel source to use in active situations is carbohydrate. It's the most efficient source of fuel to those working muscles. So incredibly important nutrient. Our carbohydrate needs, though, can be variable. So if we are doing light activity, or we might have a skill-based activity that the athlete is doing on a particular day, our carbohydrate needs will be slightly lower, and probably around the 3 to 5 grams per kilo of body weight. So in all of our nutrition recommendations, we talk about grams per kilo because that's a way we can individualize it to each person that we're working with. So then we move up from a light 3 to 5 grams per kilo as the exercise gets closer to perhaps a moderate exercise at about 60 minutes per day. On those days, our adolescent or adult athletes will require more around the 5 to 7, and then it keeps going up from there. If we're training for 1 to 3 hours per day, we're looking at 6 to 10 grams per kilo. And then for our very high, like heavily endurance-based athletes who are training sort of usually 4 or 5 hours a day, it means they're doing 2 to 3 sessions per day, we might see carbohydrate intakes of upwards of 8 to 12 grams per kilo. They are incredibly big targets and require a lot of individualized support for athletes to be able to achieve that. Also, when you're training 4 to 5 hours a day, available opportunities to consume that volume of food can be difficult. So working with a sports dietitian in those scenarios is highly recommended. When should we think about using our carbohydrate foods around training? Essentially, when we're individuals, we're looking at needing them on almost all occasions. So all of our meals throughout the day should have a carbohydrate focus. The amount could be different, but carbohydrate should be present at all our meals. Certainly at a snack in advance of a training session, particularly if that exercise is going to be at high intensity. Carbohydrate as close as practically possible. So within 30 to 60 minutes of a training session is recommended, even if you've had a good meal a couple of hours before that. In sessions that are requiring high intensity efforts throughout the session or continuous work at a high intensity, and those sessions are longer than 60 minutes, we would often be recommending an athlete to incorporate intra-session fueling, so carbohydrates within the session. And that might be things through easy to consume and digest carbohydrate foods, or sports foods like gels, or even liquid things like carbohydrates and those types of, sports drinks, which contain carbohydrates, can help fuel there. We'd also be looking at carbohydrate as close as practically possible post-training sessions. That's when our muscles are most receptive to regeneration of those carbohydrate stores that have just been used up. So frequency of carbohydrate is really, really important for our highly active individuals, both adolescent and adult athletes. So energy, these are continuing in the macronutrient vein. The next one is protein. Now, carbohydrates and proteins, interestingly, actually yield for the body similar amounts of energy. So 16 and 17 kilojoules per gram for both carbohydrates and proteins, but they have quite different functions in the body. So carbohydrates certainly provides the fuel and the petrol to muscles and brains, whereas proteins probably more like the building blocks of our tissues and things like muscles. So, and as a result of those amino acids, which are the building blocks of protein, they are crucial in so many of our physiological functions and bodily processes. So skin, bones, ligaments, tendons, the health of those are all affected by our protein intake. Our immune system requires adequate protein to work at its best. Building muscle, people are pretty aware of that. We certainly need protein in order to build muscle. Doing resistance training is part of the puzzle. That provides some stimulus, but we need the protein to be able to build that into lean tissue. Protein requirements are higher for adolescent athletes because of all that tissue development that is occurring. And certainly protein is important for tissue repair. So think of injury and those sorts of things as well. So protein certainly gives the body energy in terms of kilojoules or calories, but it has a really, really big functional element to how our body needs to look after or use protein. Protein sources. So generally speaking, we often think of protein sources as coming from animal-based products. So things like fish, chicken, beef, pork, but also our dairy food. So if it was an animal or comes from an animal, as crude as that sounds, tends to be our highest sources of protein, our animal-based proteins. But we can get protein through a mixed and varied diet, which includes plant-based sources of protein. So things like legumes, beans, nuts, seeds, and our meat alternative products, which are generally made from some of those items, are also good sources of protein as well. So we can get it in a number of places, but certainly it's quite efficiently found in those animal-based products. As far as how much protein, this again is a gram per kilo. So often for adolescent athletes, we're looking at needing 1 to 1.5 grams per kilo. So a non-active adolescent or an adult might get away with around 1 gram per kilo, but certainly we'd be looking at, probably for most active people, at least that 1.5 grams. I do have athletes that I work with, both developing adolescent athletes as well as elite, where those protein numbers are hitting much higher. Often they're getting in excess of upwards of 2 grams per kilo. That's not because the body, you don't get more and it does more and there's more benefit. It's just as a function. They eat such a large volume of food that they just by instance of having that amount of food tend to have much higher protein intakes as a result. What's important about protein is that we get the total amount across the day, and that's that amount there, that 1 to 1.5, often higher, grams per kilo. But when we consume protein, so the frequency and timing of our protein intake is really, really important for getting the maximal benefit from protein. So when we're working out an athlete's total daily requirement for protein, I will then look out for ways that I can deliver that protein to them in 4 to 5, occasions of eating. So that those bolus amounts of protein, which you often end in the ballpark of around 20 to 30 grams, when we look at how much is required at each one of those occasions, that regular consumption of protein also assists with whole body, protein balance. But really critically, eating protein stimulates muscle building. It doesn't matter where, the resistance training in a gym, for example, or not, or any type of resistance training, that's a stimulus to build muscle. But most people are fascinated to hear that actually the consumption of protein all by itself stimulates the pathways to generate muscle. So not only is it good to spread that protein intake out, just because it's practical often for an athlete to try and do it across the day than all in one go. Protein is very filling, but having those regular bouts of protein throughout the day will actually help with muscle protein synthesis, which is obviously advantageous for athletes. Another key area we focus on is where an athlete has done high intensity work, which can cause stress and sometimes known and planned damage on the muscle. Same with lifting weights. We're putting load into the muscle to cause some little micro tears, and it's when those muscles repair and rebuild, that's where we get muscle growth and strength gain. So protein is really important. The total's important, having it regularly throughout the day, and where we can time one of those occasions to be immediately post-exercise, maybe in about a roughly hour window, will certainly be adding benefit from a muscle gain perspective. So that's important from a protein as well. So a little bit similar to carbohydrate, how would we structure meeting those protein requirements throughout the day? Well, we actually will need athletes, both developing and adult athletes, will actually need to include protein at every meal and snack in order to hit those targets. I often find by including and focusing on recovery, protein, a snack that contains protein and recovery, not only is that another occasion to get in through the day, but it's another way to, solidify the muscle growth and repair. I often find a really important and sometimes missed area for athletes with really high energy needs and high protein needs, and also a time poor across the day, is I will often recommend for adolescent athletes and high energy consuming athletes that a supper or a before bed, a post dinner snack is incredibly important. It's quite difficult to meet all of those needs without finding that one last hit overnight. There's also some evidence around protein in particular prior to bed, helping with muscle recovery and a little bit from a sleep perspective too. So we can tick lots of boxes by perhaps looking at that before bed snack for our adolescent, but also high energy consuming athletes. Then I'll look quickly at fats. I think in sports nutrition, we hear a lot about carbohydrates and proteins, but I just want to take a moment to mention the role of fat in our diets. So the role of fat is important. It can be an energy source. So certainly for athletes where I've achieved their protein and carbohydrate requirements, but I need more total calories, I'll often try and use energy dense items, which includes the items that might have a little bit more fat in them. I'll talk about the types of fat in a moment. But fat is certain types of fat, the nourishing, healthier fats, are really important for heart health and improving our blood cholesterol levels. As I mentioned, can be used as a source of energy. We have some vitamins and minerals that we get from food that are only able to be absorbed by the body in the presence of fat. So vitamins A, D, E, and K are what we call fat-soluble vitamins. So we absolutely need a level of fat in the diet in order to absorb those really critically important micronutrients. Our cell membranes and the structure of our cells require fat. Hormones use fat in order to be produced, so incredibly important from a hormonal regulation perspective. Our brains are 60% fat, so we need, in terms of certainly growing and developing our brain as an organ, we need some of those healthy fats. We also know that there's emerging evidence around the use of a particular type of fat, omega-3s, may protect the brain from and have a role in head injury, so prevention and protection. We've known for a long time omega-3s act as an anti-inflammatory. We know that can be really good for brain health and cognition. And also cholesterol lowering, but they are emerging more and more as an important fat for us to consider including in our diet. There's a couple of different types of fats. So, people sort of, the word fat can sometimes people assume may not be always a good thing for us, but we probably need to be a little bit more specific when it comes to fats. Certainly there are a couple of varieties of chains of fatty acids. They are saturated fats and trans fats, which generally are found in processed foods. Saturated fats are generally found in animal-based products, so the fat we find on meat and in meat and dairy foods and things like butter. They are a source of saturated fats. Those saturated fats and trans fats are probably not as high nutritional value. They certainly have the same calories as all fat, but in terms of the benefits that they supply are much less compared to what we call our unsaturated fats. So mono and polyunsaturated fats and omega-3 fats are very nourishing sources of fat for the body. As I mentioned before, anti-inflammatory effects, brain protection, mood. We're seeing lots of benefit of these nourishing fats from a mood perspective. So fat is not something to fear. Certainly in athletes with high energy demands, incorporating fat can help them meet those demands, and where we can choose really nourishing ones, like we're thinking high quality olive oils, nuts, seeds, avocado, vegetable oils are really, really important. Olives are really important to try and incorporate into our diets. Even as non-athletes, they are a really important component. So now I want to quickly touch on some of the the key micronutrients that certainly I spend a lot of the time in my elite athletes trying to make sure we are addressing and monitoring and managing. Now that's at the elite end where athletes might have finished growth and development, but these two are not only critical at that end, but they are even more so for our growing and developing emerging athletes undergoing growth. The first one I want to mention there is iron. So iron is actually a protein. Iron is carried around our body by a protein called ferritin, and it's stored. We store ferritin to help transport our oxygen around the body. Okay, so iron is highly, highly important oxygen carrier, taking that oxygen to our muscles so that they can, and brain, but to our muscles in particular, so that they can do work. Growth, because when we're growing, we're developing, we're building blood volume, we're growing red blood cells. Adolescents in general have much higher needs for iron, but certainly adolescent athletes will have much higher need again. It's very, very common and easy for highly active adolescent athletes to become iron deficient, and it's something that would be really important that we keep an eye on in our athletes. You can see there I've got the requirements, males versus females. So you can see the adolescent athletes on the left hand side, both males and females have much higher requirements than adults. But you'll see there's an obvious difference there between our female requirements versus our male in both age groups. And that's because of the increased losses that occur as a result of losses during menstruation. So iron, I'll talk about this a little bit more in a moment. Iron as a micronutrient found in food is actually quite poorly absorbed by the body. It's a really, really hard micronutrient for our body to absorb. So we set some of these, recommended intakes. It's set for females at 18 milligrams per day in the hopes that we actually are able to absorb about 1 milligram. And when we consider during, the first few days of a menstrual cycle, a female athlete might lose 1 milligram a day. You can see how quickly and how insidious that could be in dropping those iron requirements. And so the dropping those iron levels quite low. So why do athletes need more iron? When we're doing intense exercise, we can cause, if we're doing running or contact sports, that can cause some tissue damage that increases our iron requirements. Increased training. So as I mentioned earlier, just because when we do extra training, we're growing and developing extra red blood cells. Blood cells need iron in order to do that, so that they get sucked up into that pathway. I've mentioned menstruation. Another area that people aren't always aware of is that we actually, some of iron is stored in our sweat glands. So if we are sweating a lot, training and competing in hot and humid environments or for extended periods, we'll often see iron losses occur that way. So you can see from an athlete perspective, certainly an adolescent athlete perspective, lots of red flags there as to why iron might be low. So what might it look like for an athlete if their iron is low, or any individual? Often tiredness, extra tiredness compared to usual. Some level of fatigue is pretty normal for athletes, but compared to their usual. Feeling like their endurance has been reduced, so their capacity to complete sort of longer training sessions, shortness of breath, dizziness. Headaches is another common one. Dizziness, I mentioned earlier, they sometimes will go together. Difficulty concentrating and recall, and certainly irritability. So those people online who may have teenagers in their midst, fatigue, lethargy, some of that general malaise, irritable, you might think that's just normal teenager behaviour, and quite possibly it can be. But I do urge people to have a think about, if they think that iron might be something to look at for their athlete, to not delay maybe having that tested. It's not common for certainly for male athletes in particular to have their iron routinely tested, but I would encourage people to have a look at those levels from time to time if you have someone in your midst who's experiencing, or you yourself might be experiencing, any of those symptoms. What we see from a performance perspective is, with slower recovery, increased heart rates, more likelihood of injury and illness in low iron, when iron is suboptimal. So definitely lots of things that can be quite obvious that might happen to an athlete. obvious but easily attributed to other things. And that's why iron can be sometimes missed as a possible cause of some of these symptoms. It's very easy to have iron tested, and often it's one of the highly treatable. We call it sometimes in sport, it's a low-hanging fruit. If we've got athletes rolling around with suboptimal iron and we can correct that, we often see some really wonderful outcomes for those athletes. So being aware of that one's really important. We mostly get our iron, most people are probably aware of this, but we mostly get our iron from the best type of iron that's most easily and readily absorbed by the body occurs in our sort of lean red meats and organ meats, and also to a degree in our other animal-based meats in terms of fish, poultry, seafood, etc. Our body is much more able to absorb the type of iron from these foods. It's still hard, but it's better. Although we can get iron from other plant-based sources. So they are things like dried apricots, eggs, our legumes, green leafy vegetables, but you have to consume a lot more of those in order to do that. So if we were trying to increase our iron intake, we'd be looking at 3 or more red meat meals per week. Where an athlete has capacity and access to having that more, I will often include it more in their diet, particularly if they're developing and growing and developing. One of the ways that we can improve the iron absorption of those foods at a meal is by including a source of vitamin C. So looking at high vitamin C vegetables included in meals that contain red meat, or citrus, or a glass of orange juice or berries alongside meals containing iron can be a way that we can better absorb those. One of the things that can inhibit iron absorption is if we're drinking strong tea or coffee at the same time as iron-rich foods. So if I've got someone who's at risk of low iron, or we're actively trying to improve iron status, I'll get them to move those drinks between meals and away from the meals that we're trying to get their iron in. So that's how we can improve that one. The other micronutrient that's incredibly important to keep an eye on is calcium. So calcium requirements are really, really high through puberty in our growing adolescent. The rate of calcium deposits that goes into our bones, it's actually about 300 milligrams per day. It's kind of huge. We lay down our peak bone mass by the age of 18. So we've got to 18 to lay the foundations. From then on, we're sort of white knuckling and trying to hold on to our calcium deposits in our bones thereafter. So certainly adolescence is a really important time to make sure we're achieving our calcium intake. The recommendations for adults are around 800 milligrams, but that jumps to 1,300 milligrams per day for our growing and developing athletes. So that generally requires 3 or 4 serves of ideally dairy containing foods, just because it's the most efficient way to get calcium in. But we rely on those each day. Unfortunately, our calcium requirements during puberty kick up just at the time we find some, certainly female teenagers, start to move away from drinking milk with meals and snacks. And we often see the replacement of milk, for example, as a standard drink to things like juices, sports drinks, bubble teas, all of these other types of soft drinks, all these other things that certainly teenagers tend to drift away from milk into those. And unfortunately, that's the worst possible time that we could move away from those items. As I mentioned earlier, generally our dairy containing products are the richest and most efficient sources of calcium, but certainly fish with edible bones is another way we can get huge amounts of calcium in as well. Don't have a lot of my teenagers who are as au fait with some of those, but if I can incorporate salmon, I will do that. If you choose plant-based sources of dairy, we just need to make sure that we are choosing and reading labels. They often are fortified with calcium, but we just want to make sure we are choosing those options if we aren't able to have those dairy efficient calcium sources. So they're my 2 really big ticket items for calcium. So 3 or 4 serves a day for adolescents. The great thing about dairy foods is that they're also a good source of carbohydrate and protein. So I find in my meal plans for all athletes, if they are able to consume dairy foods, they are on high rotation because they tick so many of those big ticket boxes for athletes as well. So they'll often be in there as well. Similar to iron, we do want to limit tea and coffee at the same time as our calcium-rich foods, just to, again, they sort of compete for absorption in the gut. So trying to limit those. What I say to people, that doesn't mean if you like milk in your coffee, not to have that milk. You absolutely will contribute a little bit, but I wouldn't tend to use that as the one of their serves that day. I'll probably find another spot to pop a calcium-rich food in there as well. So how do we pull all this together? How do we create a balanced plate? I like to use the hand model where we divide the plate into sections for our carbohydrates, our proteins, our fats, and also our colourful starchy vegetables. And the basic, I guess, rule of thumb is that an open sort of fist represents our carbohydrates. The palm of the hand represents our protein. Our vegetables, which we want to take up the biggest portion of the plate, our fruits and vegetables, they're a double hand. And in terms of our healthy fats, our nourishing fats, about a thumb's worth is what we would consider a serve. So we use that breaking the plate into half the coloured vegetables, quarter carbs, and a quarter protein. That's our base. Okay, so that's an easy visual way I help athletes understand what a plate should look like for them as a person. Then what we do based on their energy needs is we start to combine those things together. So I will say to an athlete, look down at your plate and there's a rule, there's a checklist. You need to be able to identify a source of carb, a source of protein, a nourishing fat, and some colour. And I will help athletes be able to identify how to put all of those combinations together. So as long as they can look down and they can see all of those combinations, all four, they're generally going to be ticking many of those boxes, okay, from a nutrient perspective. Then what we do is we need to be able to scale that. In particular, carbohydrates are the ones that is the nutrient that needs to scale the most based on energy needs. So on rest days, you'll see the carb just sticks to that baseline we talked about, the open fist. But you'll see as we go up for moderate training, protein doesn't change, carbs change. So you'll see we have to keep increasing, that carbohydrate on the plate real estate, for want of a better term, depending on how high our training needs are for any given day or week. Then if you drop to a low training day, you drop back to this. So that's called periodizing our carbohydrate intake based on our needs. But just remembering, this is our base. Okay, this is what everyone's plate should look like with the rule of 4. And then we adjust up carbs as required based on our needs. So moving into hydration, here in southeast Queensland, it's a big ticket item for us. We are living, working and training in a hot and humid environment. Certainly in the southeast where I am, we do have hot and humid environment, but I grew up in Rockhampton and my family is all based in Townsville, so I've felt North Queensland as well. And obviously that's an area that we particularly, as practitioners working in Queensland, are working often sometimes at much higher levels around this space for our athletes. As far as hydration status goes, we look at our body is in, I guess, a balance from a hydration perspective. We lose water through urine, sweat, skin losses, and just breathing in and out, funnily enough. And we can bring water balance in through fluids and food. Lots of our foods, you think about things like yogurts, etc., soups, all contain high levels of water. So all of that counts. We know that our body is made up of more than 50% water, and it's important for every cell and tissue to be able to function well. We actually require water to do that. As far as exercise goes, our blood supply is the most fluid thing traveling around our body. So if we are dehydrated and we've lost some fluid volume, we've actually lost blood volume. Now, blood is also how nutrients required for exercise and high performance get around our body. So if our blood volume is less, we have less oxygen and carbohydrate and nutrients traveling to our muscles, and that can impact performance. We also require our body to be able to manage core temperature. Believe it or not, our organs don't like getting heated up. So sweating, which is one of the key ways athletes will lose water from the body, sweating is actually a really important physiological function. It's our body's way of trying to get rid of heat. Okay, so our body heats up, our blood vessels dilate. That's why we go red. That's one way our body tries to dissipate heat. Otherwise, our brain stimulates sweat glands to produce sweat, releases to the surface of our skin, and when it's evaporated, we cool down. So sweating is important. We want to be sweating, okay, because that helps keep our core temperature cool, particularly our brain and internal organs. Issue comes when our rates of sweat and rates of replacement are mismatched and we start to become dehydrated. I talked about some of those performance effects. So certainly our blood volume decreases, our aerobic and endurance capacity decreases, but our skill, our fine motor skills and cognitive function, so decision making in the heat of a competition or a race, can be impacted by a lack of adequate fluid and body fluid balance. What we might see someone who's dehydrated is poor concentration, really dark concentrated urine output, headaches, dizziness, thirst. Now, I will say many of the performance effects have already started to go south before we'll feel thirsty. So thirst isn't a great indicator from a performance perspective, but certainly from a physiology perspective, it can be. Also, when we're dehydrated, our perception of effort increases. So things just feel harder. So that's not great from a performance perspective as well. I think we've all felt that, doing something in heat versus in a cooler weather, things do feel harder. At the more severe end, where we're getting into sort of really high levels of dehydration and also potentially alongside heat stress, that's when we'll see the disorientation, confusion, heart rate's really high. Sometimes we've all seen those horrible images of people collapsing at the finish line. So how can we keep on top of our, and have an understanding of where we're at from a hydration point of view? The most simple tool I can give you is looking at urine. If you or your athlete is going to the toilet frequently and that urine is pale and straw coloured, they're probably pretty good from a hydration perspective. But if that is more concentrated and we're getting dark orange coloured urine, probably we've got some work to do there. And that's a really simple way that you can assess where you're at from a hydration perspective. So some tips for our athletes to stay hydrated: always start early. So I will say to an athlete, whether you're thirsty or not, try and that first, when you rise of the morning, try to have 200 to 500 mils upon waking or with that early morning pre-trained snack or breakfast. Then we want to sip on small mouthfuls of cool, not ice cold, water regularly throughout the day and also through exercise. Why not cold? I hear you asking from the ether there. Because we rely on volume to rehydrate, what we sometimes find is when water is icy cold, an athlete can have a couple of sips and feel quite refreshed and quite satiated from a thirst perspective, but that they require the volume. So cool rather than ice cold is generally better, and making that fluid palatable. So flavouring that can be important for some people too. Our rule of thumb for how much fluid we actually need, again, it's a mils per kilo, which is really helpful. It's around 30 to 35 mils per kilo that the body requires just for adequate hydration without accounting for the needs of exercise. So I will say to athletes, your baseline, like I'll work out the 30 mils per kilo and say that's your standard, whether you're training or not. And then we will try and add additional in for training. I have athletes who sweat anywhere between 300 mils up to 1.2 litres per hour. So rehydration recommendations are incredibly individualised based on an athlete's sweat rate. And we do test and calculate their sweat rates in our sort of more high performance environments to give that individualised feedback. A question I often get.
Oh, yep. Okay, I was just going to let everyone know we're just at 12:48, so we've just gone a little bit longer. But I'm absolutely loving what's listening to you talk. So please, I just want to let everyone know Kel's nearly through.
I am nearly through. Yes.
Yeah. So just hang in there, guys. And I'm sure no one wants to tune out anyway because it's fascinating. So please keep going. Sorry, Kel. I just
excellent.
Want to let you know.
Thank you. We are very close to the end, and if I can finish, then the last bit will recording as well. A really common question I do get is, when do I need water? When do I need electrolytes, which are a supplement like sodium and potassium that sometimes we add to drinks to replace what we lose in sweat? And I get, when do I need sports drinks? They all serve a different purpose. Water is great if it's a short session, we're not in a hot and humid environment. Absolutely, water should be first and foremost, and we should always have water even in conjunction with the others. I'll add electrolytes to someone's water supply if they are training and exercising in a hot and humid environment and or they have high sweat rates. When I'll add a sports drink, which is both fluid and electrolytes and carbohydrate, is only when we require intra-session fueling as well. So sports drinks with carbohydrate are not required from a hydration perspective. They're generally when we need to add actual fuel into a session. So that's sort of the difference between the two. So water first, and then it's water plus electrolytes, or water plus electrolytes and carbohydrate via the sports drink. And different athletes will need different things on different days. So being across all of those will be important. But our 8-year-olds at 8 a.m. on a Saturday morning doing 2 40-minute soccer halves absolutely will not need a sports drink supplement if they've had some breakfast before they've headed out to that match. The last and the shortest part of my presentation today is just talking about the role of supplements. I want people to understand that even in our high-level Olympic environment here, that supplements are the sprinkles on top for our athletes. Certainly our foundational diet, and also combined with the training. The training is paramount. The nutrition to support that's our cake and the icing. Okay, we must have those two things in order to improve performance. There is no point adding supplements in, which are the sprinkles on top, if we haven't addressed proper training strategies with nutrition to support it. I heard someone maybe think, well, hang on, what about if we eat cupcakes without icing? Can we just train ourselves? No. Who eats cupcakes without icing? We need the two. Nutrition has to support a training load in order to improve and to get training adaptations, and they are the icing on the top. Just really quickly, when we're talking about supplements, it's important to understand they can be quite different. We've got medical supplements. So someone has an iron deficiency, we treat that with an iron supplement. So that's called a medical supplement. We have things which are sports foods. So they are foods and drinks which are formulated not because the protein in a protein powder is better than the protein in a glass of milk, the gel, a carbohydrate gel is better than eating, a cup of rice. Sports foods tend to be formulated for their practical applicability to be able to use them within and around training sessions. So they're a convenience, not a necessity. So that's a sports food. Then we have sports performance supplements, so ergogenic aids. So they're things like the strategic use of caffeine for performance, the strategic use of buffers to buffer lactic acid would be an example. Creatine. We get creatine from food, but not in the quantities to produce a performance benefit. So we have to use supplemental. So they are performance aids as well. We are really lucky. We have the most comprehensive supplement program and guidance in Australia compared to the rest of the world. So the Australian Institute of Sport has a supplement framework which divides supplements into A, B, C, D categories. And they are constantly reviewed and checked, and there's a supplement panel which reviews things to be uploaded into here. So our category A supplements are those that tend to be have the most amount of efficacy. They've got lots of data supporting their use. Category B might be emerging. So they might be things that look promising, but we're still developing our research in that space. Category C are things that we don't have a lot of evidence for, or the evidence is just starting. We don't have enough to sort of move it sort of through there, but it might be still applicable for some people in some certain situations. Our category D supplements are those that are banned or high risk of contamination, which is really important for the pointy end of the scale for athletes who are in the World Doping Organization testing pool. That's really important, but important for all athletes. Whether they're being tested or not, I will have athletes understand this framework from the time they're very, very young. That framework is there for everyone to see. The link's there in the notes for the AIS supplement guidelines. The questions I ask myself and the athletes is, when I'm considering the use of a supplement, is it safe? Is it efficacious? Does it work for your sport and for your individual circumstances? And is it permitted to be used in sport? So is it safe? Does it work? Is it legal? Do I need it? They are the 4 things we ask ourselves. And it's very systematic when we go through that with an athlete before we use a supplement, because all supplements come with risk, and can be expensive, and can also be a waste of time if we don't have our base right. So as I said, they're the sprinkles on top. They're not actually one of my big rocks. I include it today because I get so many questions around that. But it's important that that's a targeted approach. And I would really encourage people to seek individualized support from an accredited sports dietitian if you're considering the use of supplements, particularly in someone who is underage, so under the age of 18, so still growing and developing. It's really important to get personalised individual advice. Where can you get more info and support? As I mentioned, for the supplements, you can head to the AIS website. The AIS also has a beautiful series, have developed a series of modules and lectures around, if you think about my big rocks today, each one of them is its own module. So I've sort of glossed a little bit to give you the big ticket items, but you can dive deep by heading to the AIS website to check out if anything I've said today sparks some interest, or you think, I want to know more, I want to understand more in a deeper level. I would highly encourage that you have a look at those, and or share with the communities, the sporting communities in which you work and play. So that could be something you could share amongst your team, your club, your association, your state sporting organisation. Those pathway, like that has been put together by the Elite Sporting System. I was part of that project, and they are a wonderful resource if you don't have access or the means to access accredited sports dietitians in the area that you're located. The other source of great contact is the Sports Dietitians Australia website. There's info, there's fact sheets, there's blogs, there's recipes, but there's also a Find a Dietitian. So if you are looking to get individualised support for yourself or for athletes that you work with or a coach, I would highly recommend you have a look at that SDA website, because it's a wealth of information. So they're my 2 go-to Australian-based sources of high quality evidence-based nutrition information, which is where I'd like people to get their info rather than things like social media and TikTok. There are some good ones out there, but it takes skill to work through which ones are correct and evidence-based and which ones are popular influencers. So start there would be my strong advice. And that brings me to the end of today's presentation. So thank you, everyone. And I appreciate we probably missed some of the opportunity for questions, but hopefully some of those questions could be answered in those resources and those websites that I've referred you to.